Hey everybody, I'm super excited because today we are getting into scene graph in the editor. No more slides. I'm going to be demoing how to make a door that opens and closes, and then we're going to add a lock to it that will lock the door to prevent you from opening it, and then we'll add a key that you can put to the lock and then unlock the door. Alright, so that's going to be our schedule for today. Let's get started on the door. Hi, I'm Mikey Jeanson, and this is Verse Boost. So first things first, let's open up our content drawer and we'll add a new folder called prefabs. And you'll notice in this episode, we will be going over it step by step instead of cutting around. People had voted for that on the survey, so I will oblige. All right, so we'll right click and then we'll click entity prefab definition, and then we'll do p_door. And we'll follow that naming convention with the p and the underscore for all of our prefabs, just for good naming conventions. All right, so we'll open it up. You'll see in the entity prefab editor that it starts with nothing, literally nothing. So we'll add our mesh component, and then we'll add the door. All right, and I want to face forward. You notice it added a transform component because anything that's visually represented in the game will have a transform. So like a particle system, even sound, stuff like that. All right, save that. And then we also have a couple components we need to add because we want to be able to interact with the door. So luckily for us, Epic's made a couple interactable components. The basic one is a child of the interactable component, and it has a few more options like the one here that we're going to use, interactable duration. Let's make this take about a second to interact with before you can open it. And then also to be able to move the door, we could use the transform, just set it to be 90 degrees open or whatever, but that would look pretty janky. Let's use a keyframe movement component to make it some smooth movement. So we'll use that in a sec. Lastly, we need to add something that we can interact with all these components in Verse. And that's where we're going to hit right here. We're going to add a new Verse component, and then we're going to name it a door component. And you don't have to use this window to start a door, like a Verse component, but it's good because it does give you some of these include statements, imports and stuff, but you don't have to, and we'll show you how to create more components without using that in a sec. Alright, so we'll start with our door component, and the lifetime method that we're going to be using, it's a lot like onBegin, but it's called onSimulate. And the reason it's like onBegin is it basically will be called, if you look here, it'll be called when the component begins simulating within the scene. So it has a few lifetime methods that will get called first. You can look at the comments to see here, on added to scene, on begin simulation, then on simulate, and then this just goes until it's removed from the scene or the simulation ends, right? Alright, so we'll go to on simulate, and then the first thing we want to do is get our component. So how do we get our interactable component? Well, we have this method on our entity, and you'll notice that components all have an entity. Every component will be attached to an entity. It's a needed thing. So we'll go self.entity, just meaning like self meaning the door component, self.entity get component, and then we'll get the type, and we'll get the interactable component. And the reason this works is because every entity can only have one type of a component. So this will return our basic interactable component that we added in here, and then we get to use it following this if statement. So the thing we're going to be looking for is we need to know when somebody comes up and presses on the door. So we will listen to the succeeded event in the interactable component, and that basically will go off after somebody holds like down E or whatever for a full second. And so we will await this event, and then when it happens, let's call like toggle door. And we haven't made this definition yet, so let's make this function right here. Toggle door, let's make it private. You could make it public if you want it somewhere else, but let's just do it for now. Alright, so toggle door, and then we need to know the state of the current door, so let's add a variable. Let's do var is opened. Alright, and then we can have this be public, and we'll do logic, and we'll do false, And then also, if we want to change this later down the line, let's make it editable so that it shows up in the prefab editor. All right, so if the door is not open, then let's open the door, right? And otherwise, let's close it. All right, so how are we gonna open the door? Well, like I talked about before, we have this keyframe movement component. So let's get the keyframe movement component just like we got the interactable component. So self.entity.get component, keyframed movement component, and there we go, a little autofill. And we forgot to specify that we're using this module, so we need to include that module. Okay, so now we've got the keyframe movement component, and let's look at it for a second. We have some play, pause, stop. Where do we set the animation? Okay, so set keyframes right here. So we're going to be calling set keyframes on keyframe movement component. And then it takes in, let's see, it takes in an array of keyframe movement deltas, and then it also has a playback mode. Okay, so first things first, let's get the keyframes. So we can make them in verse, but what if you want to make them in the editor? I think we should make an opened and closed animation within the editor. And these are keyframe movement deltas, and we'll do an array of them. I'll probably only use one, but if you wanted to have something like shutting and it has a little like slam and after effect or something where it like ricochets or rebounds, you could do it right here. All right, so let's do that. And then let's compile and let's check those out in the editor. All right, so we got to save real quick. And then we can see our keyframe movement component, or deltas, are here down in our door component. And let's say we just want to change the rotation on the up direction about 90 degrees. I think it's positive. Yep. And then on the closing one, we will do a negative 90. All right, and you have these easing functions. Let me open up this one too. So we have these easing functions, and linear will just like do all the motion linearly, but let's add like the ease in and out because it looks better. Basically, it will start slow and end slow, and it'll swing with a little more speed in the middle. All right, so those are good. Also, we have to set the duration. Looks like I forgot to do that. Let's say it takes about a second for the doors to close. All right, cool. So we got this set up. Hopefully when you save, everything doesn't go away. It's kind of annoying. All right, we'll continue back here. So we'll set the keyframes to our open door animation. And then remember, we have the keyframe movement playback mode. And what is that? That's basically either a one shot, a loop, or a ping pong. We want the one shot, so let's copy that, paste it in here, and we have to create that object so everything's in there. So we set the keyframe, and then let's press play on that animation. All right, so that should be good. And then we can follow suit with this, except we're just going to be using the closed door animation. All right, cool. So that should work. And then let's push it up and test it out. We have to add it into the level. Adding in to the level is pretty easy. Let's just grab it in and put it down. Also, I want to turn my snapping on because I'm a nerd with that stuff. Okay, so you see all of our things that we edit on the right. You can edit them here, but we'll just leave it for now. All right, so let's launch the session and I'll check back in a sec. So we're in the game. You'll notice that I'm not even in game mode, but I can still actually interact with this stuff. But you're gonna see that the door doesn't close, and that is because I don't have this looping. So what we're gonna do here is all we're gonna add is we'll add a loop, and then we'll tab this code in there, and then all of a sudden it will work. Check back in a sec. All right, so we're back. Let's go up to the door. Opens. Had a little weird glitch there. Oh shit. What's happening? I forgot to set a variable. we have to set is opened to true, and we have to set it to false here. All right, now we should be good. All right, so we walk up to it, opens, come on baby, closes. All right, sweet. Now let's get that lock on there. So now let's make the lock. So right click, P_lock, open it up. And a cool thing you can do when you're in this prefab editor is you can actually grab a mesh and drag it straight in, and you'll see it's right there. Rotate it to face it forward, and then I'm going to add a verse component to it, but we don't have to press that button every time. Let me copy this because I hate typing it out. Put it down here, and then we will change it to a lock component. Then we'll build, save, and then add the lock component. All right, sweet. And then we're going to add in a couple editables. We'll do the same thing that we did with the door, basically. Instead of is opened, it will be is locked, right? Use a logic variable. We'll start it off at true. And then like every lock, this one will have its unique groove, and we'll call that a lock code. And we'll make that a string, and we'll just do like ABC. Okay. Now let's compile that. You can see you can edit it right here, and then we'll add it into the level. So let me drag that out onto the door. But just the proximity isn't enough. We have to, have something in the code that actually knows that they're touching. So let's actually just add the lock onto the door. You see I dragged it on there, now it's in the drop down. Now the door will know about the lock. Well, not quite yet, right? We still have to check if it's locked here. So let's add something right here to check for the lock. So what's cool about scene graph, right, is that things can have components and they also cannot have components, but other components can like look for them, and if they're not there, then they won't execute that functionality, right? So in this case, we're gonna look for a lock component, but instead of using self.get like entity.get component, because it's one entity down, right? We actually have to like search for it, right, again, but we don't know if it's going to be an entity down. It could be like 2 entities down. There could be several lock components, right? So in this case, instead of doing like if, we're actually going to do for, and we're going to check for any lock component and for all of them. So what we're going to do here is we'll go for lock component, and then we'll do self.entity, but then we'll do find, this is the keyword, find descendant entities, or find descendant components rather, and then we'll add in the lock component. And this will give us all the lock components, every single one. In this case, it's only one, right? But if we had several locks, you get the idea. And if it's several entities down, it'll find any descendant component that is a lock component. All right, so we have a lock component. We'll check, we'll check up here. We'll check lock component dot is unlocked or is locked. And if any of these are true, then it will return the function. So it won't execute this code, so it won't open. Now you can see when I go up to it and try to open it, nothing works, right? It doesn't open, and that's because of the lock. So now let's create the key. So P_key, open it up, and then we'll add the mesh component, but we don't even need to add mesh component first. We can just search directly for the static mesh. And then we're also going to add another interactable component. We'll do a basic interactable again, make the duration like half a second or something. All right, and then let's go into verse and create like just the border, like the basic key component, so we can add it in. Copy that. All right, build, save, and then key component. Cool. All right, so we got that in there, and just like the lock component, we're going to have an editable for the key code, and this will line up with the lock code. So now that we have the basics for key component and we can start like comparing these codes, let's keep working on the lock component. So what I want to do for the lock component is add something that it can like sense that the key is there. And what I'm going to have to do for that is add a new mesh component. But you can't add a new mesh to the same entity that already has one. So we're going to have to add a new entity. And this, I'll name it overlap. And you kind of see where this is going. Basically, I'm going to add a mesh to overlap the key. And then I can sense all the events when it comes in. So I'm going to drag it right there, make it a little bit taller so there's a big window for the key to enter. Lines up pretty good. I'm going to turn off collidable because we don't want things colliding with it. And I'm also going to turn off visible because I don't want anything to be like visible to it. And you'll notice if I go into the level, I don't have to add it in here. You can see the overlap is already there. And I can move it around and make it visible in here too. I'm going to clear the override though. Alright, so now that we got that overlap set up, so let's get the overlap, but we can't get it the same way we were using the mesh component before. This one, because the lock component is on this entity, right? We need to go down one entity to get the mesh component from that. So to do so, we'll get all the entities that the entity has as children, and then we'll get the first one because we know that's there. And then from that, then we call get component again, and then get the mesh component. Then we want to look at mesh component and get the entity entered event. So whenever an entity enters the overlap, we'll get an overlapping entity. So we go overlap dot entity entered event, and then we'll await that, and that returns an entity, right? And we're also going to put this in a loop because we don't want to do the same mistake that we made before. So we'll do that. I'll add a little sleep -1 just to make the compiler stop yelling at us. I'll take it out later. But anyway, get rid of the red squiggles. So we get this overlapping entity, and what we want to do is check if it has a key component. So let's try to get the key component from this overlapping entity. So overlapping entity dot get component, and then key component. Alright, cool. And then if we got that, then we'll go if key component dot key code is equal to the lock code, then we can unlock. So we'll do set is locked to false, and then we can also return out of this. And then we can get rid of this. And let's add a couple statements. So let's add a print lock code and key code didn't line up. And then we'll also add another else. Print entity did not have a key component. Let's say overlapping entity just to make it a little clearer. Alright, so now we have that. And before we return, I actually want to do a couple things. I want to make the mesh of this lock actually disable because I don't want it to show anymore when somebody unlocks it. So I'm going to get the self.entity.get component, another mesh component, and this is the lock mesh. And then we're just going to call mesh component dot disable, and that will basically stop any like entity entered, any collision, and it will also make it invisible. So we'll call that right there. And while we're at it, I'm actually going to remove the key from the world after that. So this is how I do that. So I'll get the key, which is the overlapping entity, right? So we'll get the overlapping entity and then call remove from parent. And basically what this will do is it will remove, it won't let me control click on it because the IntelliSense isn't that great for scene graph yet. But when I put the entity here to define what it is, you'll see that remove from parent removes this from its parent, which will remove this from the scene. Okay, so that's great. So let's get working on the key component. So just like before, let's use onSimulate once again. because we're going to wait for the interactable component to tell us when it has been picked up. Self.entity get component, and we'll do not mesh interactable component. And once again, we'll wait for the success event. But this time we want to get the entity that is picking it up, or actually the agent rather, that is interacting. So interactable component succeeded event, remember, from the door, and then await. And let's wrap this in a loop as well. And another sleep -1 just to get rid of the squigglies for now. So we got the agent. Now we need to get the entity of the character to attach the key to, because we want to pick it up. And right now we can't put anything in the inventory. So let's do this. Let's go get the character entity from this character, or from the agent. So we go agent.get fork character .get entity. And what that does is it returns an entity from the fork character. So we can use that now to create an origin that we are going to make the key. So you'll notice if we go back here and we go to key, that every transform has an origin. So it is not set by default. But we want this key to be moving with the character. It looks like we picked it up, right? So what we have to do is create an origin that we're going to set the key to. So to do that, we got to create an entity origin. And this is a class that basically just takes an entity and makes an origin out of it. So we give it the entity, the character entity. And then what we're going to do is do self.entity. Remember, this is the key entity. And then we're going to set origin, and we're going to set it to the origin that we just created. And then we're going to return. So let's see what that does. So basically when I go to pick it up, it will like be wherever it was when I went to pick it up. And you'll see it still has an interactable component. So we should probably take that off. So what we can do is actually disable the interactable component once we have a successful interaction. So we'll go here and we'll grab the interactable component, and then we'll actually remove it from the entity. So you can actually remove components. So we don't want it to be interactable anymore. So let's remove it. And let me move that, let me put a little space in there. And then also with the set origin, if we want it to be in a specific place, we can set the local transform. So what we can do here is set the local transform for this entity. And we have to pass in a few parameters. So we'll give it a transform. Holy crap. Give it a transform with a translation of vector 3. And we're going to make it up like maybe 80. And then in front of the character, about 80 as well. Let's try that out. Now when I go to pick it up, you can see it's a little bit in front of me, a little bit ahead of me. And it's not like wherever I picked it up from. It goes to a set spot. And then we bring it over to the lock. It unlocks the door, and we can open it. Alright, so that's the end of the tutorial. Hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you guys thought about this style of video. A little bit pacing, a little bit different, more drawn out, showing you guys step by step and trying to give you guys some more insight into my working, how I work. Alright, so that's going to be the end of the video. Thank you guys for watching. Please leave a like if you liked it. Leave a comment if you have a question or like to say anything nice. And if you like to say anything mean, DMs and Twitter, please. Alright, thank you guys very much. Have a good week, and I'll see you guys in the next one. We'll do scene graph again. Alright, peace.